Hola, buenos días a todos. Andrew, yo creo que ya estamos listos para comenzar.
¿Listo? Adelante.
Listo. Bueno, por ahora tenemos a Patricia López conectada. Entonces, mientras hacemos la prueba de sonido y esperamos a que el resto de las personas se conecten, quisiera saber, Patricia, si me estás escuchando. Hay un área de preguntas acá en el panel de GoToWebinar donde podrás escribir si me estás escuchando y si puedes ver la pantalla de la presentación. Entonces te agradecería si nos escribes en el área de preguntas, si nos estás escuchando. Patricia, hola, ¿nos estás escuchando? Si quieres, Andrew, demos 2 minutos más a que se conecten las otras personas y hacemos otra vez la prueba de sonido.
Hola Juliana, estamos todavía esperando a probar o verificar que Patricia nos escucha.
Sí, sí, porque no sé si es que no encuentra la sección para escribir las preguntas o si es que no nos está escuchando.
Listo.
Hola, veo que entró también Jexibel Parisca. Quisiera saber si nos estás escuchando. En el área de preguntas nos puedes escribir y también para comprobar que puedes ver la presentación. Hola, buenos días, Jexibel, ¿nos puedes escuchar? En el área de preguntas puedes escribir si nos estás escuchando y si puedes ver la pantalla de la presentación. Perfecto, mil gracias. Buenos días. Bueno, entonces ya sabiendo que nuestro sonido funciona bien, quiero darles la bienvenida a este webinar del área de posicionamiento global de FedeSoft. Hoy contamos con la presencia del señor Andrew Martin, quien nos va a hablar un poco sobre Terminology Management y cómo asegurarnos que cuando traduzcamos nuestro contenido corporativo no se pierda, digamos, el mensaje que queremos transmitir. Esto es bastante importante para tener páginas web y pues, demás contenidos correctos. Entonces, bueno, pues simplemente los voy a dejar con Andrew Martin de Precision Translators y cualquier pregunta que tengan durante el webinar lo pueden poner en nuestra sección de preguntas y al finalizar entonces las estaremos respondiendo. Muchas gracias Andrew por estar con nosotros y te doy la bienvenida.
Okay, thank you so much. Voy a iniciar en español, pero la presentación se va a hacer en inglés. Así que hago la aclaración, ojalá que no genere ningún tropiezo, pero sabiendo que mi idioma segundo es español, yo entiendo que voy a presentar la cosa mucho más contundente y mucho más claro en mi idioma nativo, que es el inglés. So I'll make the conversion there. My name is Andrew Martin. I am a managing partner with the company Precision Translators. We are a translation company that was established in Bogota in 2008, which had already been operating since 2005 as a unipersonal in Colombia, but we established as a limited company in 2008. And just a bit of history about myself to lead into the presentation. I grew up in Tennessee in the U.S., studied industrial engineering in Tennessee, and I moved to Colombia in 2000, where I worked as a teacher at a small school for expat children, mainly the children of Christian missionaries, but also other expats who might be working with American government or corporate groups in Colombia. And while living in Colombia from 2000 to 2005, I worked there as a science and a math teacher at a small school called El Camino Academy in the north of Bogota. In 2005, I began translating, and that was just a family business that my wife and I began together, but it grew into a business venture, which was consolidated when we founded Precision Translators in 2008. With that background, I just like to use that to lay the foundation. That's why I'm here to talk to you today about terminology management, which is a topic that's real dear to my heart, something that we've had to consider and reconsider and create processes and create corporate thinking for within our company to define how we would manage the terminology of the different customers that we serve in Colombia and around the world. So today's presentation is really meant to focus specifically on terminology management for global companies. With all that said, let's go ahead and jump into the contents of the presentation. Four basic points that we just want to touch on here. The first one, what is terminology? And that sounds maybe like an overly simplistic question, but what is terminology in the context of a global company? How does it affect you as a global company, a global buyer or seller of products and services, including every way that it could affect you, from communications internal to external communications with those who provide services or products to you, or those who invest in your company? What is terminology management? Why would we even focus on a topic like managing terminology? And what goals can we set for global brands? And I kind of set the stage today just to talk about, lead up to those goals, and leave the door open if we wanted to talk in more depth about them later. But let's go ahead and kick it off with the discussion of what is terminology. For global brands, terminology is the study of terms and their use. Terms, for our purposes, are going to be words or phrases that describe our products, our services, our industry, industry jargon, and this concept of terminology for a global player is often going to be what drives its competitive advantage in the market. For our company, for my company, the name of our company is Precision Translators. The very name of our company should define who we are and what we're doing. And internally, as we communicate with our staff or as we communicate with others, something as simple as our name, we have a very clear expectation that transmits a message to our customer. We are capable of and we are interested in communicating precisely. We want those who look to us for services or support in the industries that we're serving to see us as a company who's capable of doing things accurately, of transmitting their message from one language into another language so that it very clearly portrays the same meaning in that other language. And with every company, with each of your companies, we would expect that you have a number of different ways of speaking about yourselves that are expected to portray an image to buyers of your services, to those who sell to your company, to those who invest in your company. So when we refer to terminology for this environment, that's what we're talking about. What is terminology? I'd like to just go through some examples and share some examples of really what might seem like very simple words or very clear, well-defined words, and kind of discuss how they could be confusing to the person who might be writing in a given language or translating for your company, and use that as a case to kind of build up how we could have confusion in the language process and why it actually is important to manage terminology. One word that we run into often in our translations for the clients we serve is this term, powerhouse. What is a powerhouse? It can mean different things to different people. If you are into exercise and you live in the U.S., you'd probably find many gyms with the name powerhouse. And if that's the world I live in, if I'm a physical education teacher or if I'm a coach or if I'm an exercise facility owner, when you say the word powerhouse, I'm likely going to be thinking about the gym down the street. That's all well and fine, but also if you look online and you Google it really quickly on an English-speaking website, you'd find that same word is used to associate with the name of a common seafood bar and grill found on the coast here in the U.S. So if you live near that restaurant and you are talking about going down to the powerhouse to grab a bite to eat, you're probably talking about running down to the restaurant. Or if you live in New York City and you're into rap music or R&B and you hear someone talking about the powerhouse, you might be thinking about radio station 105.1 and these types of artists who are creating and airing their music on this radio station daily as a place where you might go to listen to your music of choice. For us, none of those meanings portray what we understand a powerhouse to be. For us, in our company, we serve the hydroelectric power generation market. We serve several companies throughout that market, those who generate electricity, those who take it from the source of generation and distribute it from the dam to the town. And for us, a powerhouse is the facility at a dam where generators, you can see the generators lined up here, where generators are connected to a energy source, in this case water, that flows through those generators, and it produces electric power to distribute to the world around that dam, the communities, the towns, the cities. That's a powerhouse for us. And in Spanish, that term is casa de máquinas. And you can see really quickly how a word that if you're in a given industry and you're used to talking about that word on a regular basis, how it would seem to have a really simple meaning, and you'd expect everyone to know what it means, but as a writer comes in to write about your information, maybe to create marketing pieces or maybe to create content to share with shareholders, or a translator comes to take that word and transform it to another language, if they don't have some context, if they don't have a bigger view of terminology for your company, there's a really good chance that they might misconstrue that word and they might write something totally different than what it means when they transfer that word to another language. What is terminology management? I think from the previous slides, we're building up to that pretty clearly. And just to make sure everybody knows, if you guys have questions as I'm presenting here, feel free to write those questions into the questions portion of the presentation, and I'll take a look at those when the presentation comes to an end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that show up there. What is terminology management? For companies, it's the process of systematically gathering terms, collecting and recording those terms, and making the terms, as well as any descriptive information about those terms, available to the players in their companies who might use them. And those players could be technical writers who sit within your offices, or freelance writers who are in charge of writing white papers or case studies or marketing material for your company, lawyers who are in charge of drafting contracts to be executed with your suppliers or with the customers who buy your services, translators who might translate the source content within your company to share it with those outside your company. There's many different potential players who could interact with your company and need to use terminology very specific to your company. But terminology management involves that process of gathering terminology and recording it so it can be reused by others later on. Many of you might already be doing that in Excel spreadsheets. It's a common way to manage terminology when you first begin to get involved in the global market, and you realize you have to define terms for certain source terminology, maybe related with your software interface, maybe related with your user manuals, to help keep everyone writing in a similar way, in a consistent way, managing high quality. That's terminology management, the process of keeping up with terms. It can be done in many ways, but it's the process of keeping up with terms so they can be reused by writers at later times. All right. Why would we manage terminology? There's a number of reasons. The first reason is because terms in general can be ambiguous. Because your brand is really important. You don't want to sell your brand short. As I was saying at the beginning of this presentation, my company's name is Precision Translators. In our name, in the way we present our brand, and the way we share who we are in every piece of marketing content across our company, we want others to understand we're interested in precision. In our look and feel about how we present who we are, we define ourselves, and we've made great efforts since the creation of the company to define ourselves as the most innovative company, translation company in the Colombian market, and we're pursuing that throughout all Latin America. And we believe we really are. We believe we really are the most innovative company in the translation industry in Colombia, and we believe we really rank highly in all of Latin America. And we'd be happy to stand toe-to-toe with anybody, but everything about how we say who we are affects our brand. So that's a reason for us to manage our terminology. Consistency. From one job to another piece of communication, we want to say what we say consistently, no matter who's writing, about ourselves, about our clients. We want to help project our client's image in a consistent way. Compliance is another reason to manage terminology, and we're going to get to more detailed explanations about each of these points a little further on. Efficiency. Time to market is a really big deal in this industry. often you're going to be creating content at such a pace, such a fast pace, especially in the software industry, that from the time it's created in Spanish, assuming that Spanish is your source language for all your communications, to the time it's available to others who might read it in English or Portuguese or French or German, the efficiency of that process can suffer if terminology is not well managed and made easily accessible to those who use it. So efficiency is another very important reason to manage it. And finally, quality, and potentially the most obvious reason. Now, carrying on, let's go ahead and focus on each of those individually. Just some stats here that we take from different studies that are important studies to us. In this statistic I'm giving on this slide, 50% of employees don't understand product terms. That's taken from a TCOM study, and it's obviously subjective depending on the company that's being studied, on the number of candidates who are being sampled. But 50% of employees don't understand the terms used by their company, and that can be for many reasons. And here I'd like to pick on the possibility of ambiguity. Many words, thousands of words that you're going to encounter in your company's translation process, localization process, or just the process of writing in your source language to put content on your website maybe. You're going to run into, and I'm sure you already do run into, thousands of cases where terms are just ambiguous, and that makes them hard to understand how to use, whether we're talking about using them in the source language or in a target. We'll take a term, one that we've seen in translations that we do. As I said earlier, we do lots of work in the energy sector in Colombia, largely related with hydroelectric generation. And this concept, I'll pick on the same concept I was picking on a bit earlier, powerhouse. In Spanish, that term is casa de máquinas. And we've seen it translated many ways, depending on the expertise of the person who might be doing the translation. Casa de máquinas might come out as machinery. Might come out as powerhouse because the person really understands what they're doing. But in this case, we're building up the term, and we're referring to the casino, casa de máquinas. And you might say, if you're the person writing about, what are we talking about? Are we referring to one of these? Or are we referring to one of these? It's tricky, and as a writer, it might not be immediately evident which one. A casino, if you're just thinking literally about that term, would be this. But the casino and the casa de máquinas, it's an accounting term, and that accounting term is used often in association with other expenses that are related with meals and traveling or food expenses. In this case, we're referring to the mess hall, so something much more like this in a casa de máquinas, or the mess hall in a powerhouse, the place where people would eat in that powerhouse. So if you're seeing a term like this and you're in the Colombian market and you're working for that sector, that energy sector where hydroelectric power is being generated, and you see this term, you're probably seeing a term for this image. And it's important that we can create images and context in the eyes or in the imagination of the reader so that they really correctly associate the term with what it's defining. Another really important reason to manage terminology is brand. Each of you represents a certain brand, and you want, when your brand is communicated about, whether that communication is going out in Spanish in the Colombian market, in Portuguese in the Brazilian market, in English in potentially the U.S. or Canada, you want that brand to generate certain feelings and images in the mind of the reader who's reading about your brand. Let's talk about some really easy examples, some examples that really hit the mark of why it's important to manage and to think in depth about the terminology that your company is using. Coca-Cola is an easy one to talk about. If we look at the Chinese translation of Coca-Cola, that's transliterated as Coca-Cola, or it would be pronounced a bit different. But notice if you phonetically sound that out, it's going to sound very much like the original term, Coca-Cola. Even more importantly, in Chinese, what that means is tasty fun. So it generates this feeling or this concept in the eyes, in the head of the person who's reading the wording on that Coca-Cola bottle, and they're understanding that what they're about to drink is going to make them feel better. It's potentially going to lead to a sensation of enjoyment or fulfillment. It's a really nice translation of a simple, very simple term that's probably much more complex than we give it credit on a daily basis as we pop the cap on a Coca-Cola to drink it. Another interesting one that I liked as I was studying to prepare for this presentation is the brand name Nike. Maybe one of the most interesting brand names that I could come across, because it's pronounced exactly the same way in Chinese as it is in English. So the words used to make that brand, to present that brand to the Chinese market, they don't change the sound of what's being said, and the meaning invoked is also really nice. It means enduring and persevering. Nike being a line of athletic clothing, which has been famous for its shoes for many years now. The terminology being managed there actually does generate the feeling. It is stated using the same phonetic sounds as you would from one market as different as the U.S. is to the Chinese market, and the acceptance across the markets is quite high. Other reasons for managing terminology, consistency is a big reason. 85% of employees, according to this study, use a different term to their colleagues in other departments when they're referring about the same concept. And that we see that in our line of business, we see that all the time. There's many reasons for being inconsistent. If you talk about writing or translating in multiple languages, there's many reasons. The reason I'm going to pick on here is cognate. When you transfer information from one language to another, a cognate is a term that sounds very much in a second language like it does in the first language. And when writers are writing, if they are just transferring information from one language to another, and they're often going to lean on those cognates to get fast translations. We can take a phrase like data processing, and this is one common, obviously very common to the software industry. A cognate for data processing would be procesamiento de datos, and it's an acceptable translation. I don't know that it's the best translation, but it's acceptable. People understand it, and it's used very frequently in manuals and user manuals, in big data studies. But another translation might be tratamiento de datos. And in my view, that might be the better translation. You're more embedded in the industry. You might have a different view. But what if from one person to another we're translating data processing? Sometimes it's procesamiento de datos, sometimes it's tratamiento de datos. I think what the sensation we might generate in the reader is that we're creating confusing material. The material might be confusing to the extent that we wonder, is this possibility, is this phrase, procesamiento de datos, does it mean something different than this phrase, tratamiento de datos? In essence, they don't. They really tend to usually be a translation of the exact same source content. But when we say things consistently from one document, using whatever we choose, procesamiento de datos or tratamiento de datos, we can choose what we want to, but consistently stating things in a way that generates the same knowledge in the eyes of our viewers helps us to understand and present information in an understandable way so that our readers don't get confused about what we're saying. Why else might we manage terminology? It gives a distinct advantage in markets or in situations where compliance with regulations is required. In Colombia, in the Colombian market, the DIAN has required large and small companies alike to transition their bookkeeping methods from the traditional DIAN methods that are used to do bookkeeping and present our books from those methods to the globally accepted IFRS standards. So compliance has been a big reason in Colombia to require some deeper consideration of how to manage terminology. Our companies had to go through that process, and I'm sure each of you have had to go through that process. Just to pick on a very basic word that we see often in the process of this transition is this term, obligaciones financieras. Obligaciones financieras is a Spanish term that comes up in bookkeeping that is aligned with the NIF or the IFRS in English. Variations that we see arise include operaciones de endeudamientos, operaciones de financiamiento, y actividades de financiación. A literal English translation, one that I think people understand, would be financial obligation, but one that's much more in line with the IFRS standards and one that would be hard to understand that a linguist might use unless we help them get to that term is borrowings. If the linguist happens to be highly expert in the financial world and they've translated many thousands of words in IFRS content, they're probably going to know this right off. But if they haven't, if they've been required to just jump into a financial project and they're not super familiar with the IFRS standards, they'd probably go with the first term, which could be confusing depending on the experience of your readers. Other reasons to manage terminology, and I think this is getting more to the point into the reason why companies in the software industry might want to manage terminology. In many cases, we want to increase the product time to market. In a study that we refer to often, we could see the printer company Kyocera, which many of you are probably very familiar with. They're able to increase their time to market or improve their time to market, decreasing it by 50% through a structured approach to terminology management. Meaning their writers were able to have access to terminology through server-managed databases, where whether they were translators or whether they were writers in the source language, they were able to more quickly and more effectively write what they write, increasing their productivity by up to a savings of 9 minutes per term query. When you're talking about massive user manuals, those 9 minutes per term query can really increase the efficiency of the writers. So efficiency is one of the major reasons why we would manage terminology. It helps our writers work more efficiently. To address this, I picked a term that we see often, and then one that's really common in today's marketplace. We see it across all industries, whether it's software, energy, medical, and manufacturing. The Spanish term control y prevención de LAFT. We see that come up very frequently in the translations that flow through our company. This happens to be particularly challenging for a linguist because an abbreviation like this, if the person hasn't seen it before, they're going to have to do some research, and that research might lead them to a number of possible variations in the translation. If we as corporate communicators, those who communicate on a corporate level, if we can present the translation of this term in a way that's quickly available to our linguists or those who are localizing our information, We can help them instead of having to do significant research, we can help them come to some of the possible English translations and the ones that we want them to use. The complete translation would be anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. The Spanish abbreviation, what it means is control y prevención de lavado de activos y financiamiento de terrorismo. So this translation is one, probably the most common one, if you spend some time studying this online. It's a very common translation, but we could also just offer them the English abbreviation. So for a person to go from this to this without having to do any research could save them easily 20, 30 minutes of research time if it's the first time they're seeing it. If this comes up many times, and many writers have to address and confront this term, the time savings can add up significantly over each year that you're localizing content for global markets. Another reason, and probably the most obvious reason to manage terminology, is to avoid errors, to improve quality. Up to 70% of the errors in tech documents that you might see are due to the use of bad terminology. Someone who saw a term and they just didn't know how to translate it, and they used a term that may have sounded good to them, but as a translator who may not even be trained in the software or the hardware industry or any other industry for that matter, a translator who might be trained on a very high level for taking information and converting it from one language to another, but who may not be specialized in your industry, quality can be really improved, significantly improved, if you lean on the arms of a company who can help you manage terminology. So, like I said, quality is one of the big reasons to manage terminology. Let's take a simple case, the word board. Some easy examples here. The word board could be translated in a general sense as tablero, the blackboard, the board that you'd see in front of a classroom if you were going to write for the class who's viewing your classroom teaching. That's a general translation. If someone goes to a dictionary, an English-Spanish dictionary, they might see that and they might just go with it. An aired translation that we see in IT, I've seen it, found it across some of the different translations that I've seen flow through our office, where someone takes something like Ethernet board and they use this really general translation, tablero, to translate Ethernet board as tablero Ethernet. If you're familiar with the technology, you know that's not a very good translation, and that it would be much better translated as tarjeta Ethernet. Tarjeta Ethernet. So once again, if you can capture that technology, collect it, keep up with descriptive information, and then share it to the people who write for you, you can achieve much higher quality results in the source language, target language writing than you would ever get if you're not giving your writers the terminology that you want them to use. All right. So building up here to come to a point of conclusion where we can then stop and take any Q&A that we might have. What goal might you set for global brands? If you work with a company, if your company is a global company who's already selling their product or their service in a foreign market where a different language is spoken, or who is buying services or products from a foreign market where a different language is spoken, you might already have many sources from which you can gather terms to say, we've seen our clients request that we don't use certain terms ever again. And those might be found in an email somewhere within your company, where you would actually have to go and search for that email and find what the person said and then understand it to reuse it later. Or you might have boards throughout your company where you've had team meetings and you discussed how to say things, how to share information that you want to share with the community of readers who read your content. Or it might be stored in notes files on different people's computers throughout your company. Probably, if you're in that process, you're already a global firm. You probably have a lot of terminology floating around in your company that may or may not be very structured. But as a goal that's very achievable and as a goal that gives a direction to take from this presentation, you might hope to go from something like this, where everyone's having to search on many different devices from many different sources where to find and how to find the right word for the right topic, to something more like this. Years ago, when I first became involved in the industry, I remember a linguist, a very talented linguist, who had been working as a translator for 30 years or more, giving a really nice presentation about terminology management. This was about 10 years ago for me when I heard this presentation. And she went to great lengths to explain to her audience how that audience was an audience of linguists. She went to great lengths to explain to them how they could keep up with terminology using what she called a shoebox method, meaning she would take key terms, make notes about them on index cards, and save those index cards in the shoebox, which probably had little alphabetical labels, so she could go to the A or the B or the Z section of that shoebox and find terms, starting with that letter, and see notes where she'd capture terms. It was great for her. She was just a premium level translator. She could get the right word for any of her existing client relationships that she'd been managing for many years. But based on this system, she wouldn't have she wouldn't have the ability to share her knowledge with others. So we can develop that vision to go from this very unstructured approach to something a bit more structured, which hopefully would then go to something more like this that we can more easily share with others. I'm sure you've seen examples where your company has kept up with terminology in something like an Excel file, or maybe a Word file where that Word file has a table, and you have information in English in one column or Spanish in one column, and then maybe you capture other terms. Here the terms that we're looking at are Korean, and then maybe you even have phonetic spellings of those terms. And that Excel file could be sent by email to anyone who could then look through it and, oops, sorry about that, who could look through it and then understand how to translate a given word, like the word may in Korean. And I think ultimately, if you're really setting goals to have a very structured, a very clear approach to terminology management, what you could be shooting for is something a lot more like what we see on the screen here, where you're able to share images. In your industry, those images might be the buttons on your software interface. So a person, when they see a term, and I'm using a term from a tourism text that we've translated before, and I guess let's focus on this term, then I'll make it more relevant to the translation industry. A term like pitaja, which if you've lived in Colombia very long, or probably some border countries to Colombia, you would understand that a pitaja is this type of fruit. But if you're translating that fruit into English and you've lived most of your life in the U.S., you may have never seen that fruit. And you certainly would have to do a little research to decide that it's best translated as a yellow dragon fruit. But if you're managing terminology with a structured approach, as a company who desires to make sure that every incoming term in whatever source language you manage has a clearly defined target term and has clear guidance so that your translators know how and when to use that term correctly, you might go another step, especially if you're in the tourism industry. You might take the time to share the scientific name, because that scientific name could be Googled, and you can search it and look at images, and you can verify that this term right here really is the correct term for this fruit. Then you can associate that scientific name with the name in English and understand that the person really did get the correct English term for the incoming Spanish term, pitaja in this case. And if you were in the software industry, in your industry, you might do that for every button within your software interface, so that when someone refers to the edit button or to the copy button or the cut button, let's pick on cut. If someone were to refer to the cut button, that's referring to the little button, the little icon in the user interface where you see the scissors. That's obvious to us all right now, but for anyone in the software industry, your interface might have hundreds of different icons and buttons and command names and screen viewing areas. And if you can correctly capture those and manage them in an environment that's more structured, something like this, which can be quickly delivered to the linguist who might use that information, your chance of getting the translation that you really believe you should get, it goes up exponentially. So that kind of brings me to the end point of the presentation. What I really wanted to go through today in this presentation was to lay the foundation for this concept of terminology management, why terminology management is important for global organizations like yours, and define what terminology is, define why we would even want to manage it, and what that management implies, and then go through some cases like the ones we looked at, and to end up with a map there to give us some goals of what we could go from, which might really clearly present the case of your company today, from a very unstructured approach where everyone is sharing data from different sources that are not really managed, to a very highly structured approach, which could even be hosted on servers where you have multi-relational databases, where linguists can tap into those servers and see the terminology that you want them to use and have a much higher likelihood that your linguists and your writers, that they write and they translate in a structured, clear, high quality, and highly efficient way that permits you to get your materials out to the market at much faster paces than you would otherwise. Now, I kind of created this presentation with the goal of leaving the door open so we could go into more detail and talk about how to achieve these things. If anyone's interested, that would be a next step. That would be a next presentation where we really go into detail about the tools that are available in the market to manage terminology, how to centralize that terminology in different server settings, and how to make it available to your linguists so they can really do a better job. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? I'll go to the questions area here, but if you do have a question and you haven't recorded it in the questions area yet, now would be the time to do that. I'll be happy to take any questions and provide any answers. So I'll just wait a minute here. And if no questions come up, then I will go ahead and stop the session and pass back to Fedisoft. Anyone? All right. So if there are no questions, and it seems like there's not, I would like to go ahead and pass this presentation back to the webmaster there at Fedisoft. If you can take control and wrap things up, I would appreciate it. Ya llegamos al fin. Les voy a cerrar y si hay otras dudas, con mucho gusto podemos responderlos fuera de este ámbito. Gracias y chao. Ya. Yes, it's quiet now. Hola, Mafe, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, bien, ¿y tú?
Muy bien. Mafe, no sé si estabas observando ahí el foro. No había sino, en un momento había hasta 3 participantes, pero no había más.
Lo máximo que vi fueron 7 y mínimo los 5